Good morning and welcome. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Wilson Center. And we're particularly pleased today to be working with Rinrock International, the Sustainable Water Partnership, and USAID to bring you this conversation about the challenge of too much water, ensuring sustainable water resilient communities. And as you know from the description of today's event, having too much water can be as deadly as having too little. And exploring the different dimensions of water dynamics has been a long-standing focus of our Environmental Change and Security program here at the Wilson Center. Many of you know that we do a lot of work on applied research, we do public convening, and we do a lot of work around strategic communications, and we do this across sectors. Most recently, the Wilson Center was recognized by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank globally for transdisciplinary research. And our work on water dynamics has crossed many of these sectors. So we're very pleased to continue that work in this vein this morning. And I'm really delighted that we have a number of colleagues who have been thinking about these issues for a while to share some of their perspectives and thoughts. And we look forward to engaging with you. So we will start with Melissa Opresco, who's the Health Team Lead and Senior WASH Advisor for USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. She's been a WASH advisor there for about 6 years and has more than 20 years' experience in environmental health, both internationally and within the United States, including questions around disaster response, research, community development, and regulatory oversight. So Melissa, welcome, and we hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a presentation there we go. So I'm going to do a very quick flyby on disaster response around flooding and looking both at coastal flooding and river flooding, and so, but very briefly. So starting out, next slide. So OFDA, for those who aren't aware of it, we're the lead U.S. office for international humanitarian response. We have offices around the world. We have our headquarters here. We are part of USAID, but we operate in many cases in very different rapid responses. We have both proactive and reactive programming. Our proactive is really around disaster risk reduction, and with flood-prone areas, we're looking at early warning systems. This is an example of a tsunami warning. What do you do if you hear or see some of these warning signs? How to save lives is our #1 mandate. And other proactive disaster risk reduction programs focus on emergency operations centers, preparedness, evacuation centers, so really looking at those areas at greatest risk of flooding events. Reactive is really what we do most, and that is programming through NGOs, UN agencies, and other organizations to respond when a disaster does happen. Oh, look at that. Isn't that nice? Okay. So I want to speak briefly about the impacts on health. Since our mandate really is primarily save lives, reduce suffering, and alleviate economic and social impacts, the #1 thing is saving lives. And with flooding events, there are traumatic injuries, there's drowning. Those, for example, this is sadly a picture from post-Haiyan in the Philippines, where over 6,300 people died. Much of that was from drowning, and along the coastal areas where they're the most vulnerable populations are living in marginalized land, they're extremely vulnerable to storm surges. But along with injuries and drowning, there are waterborne and water-related diseases. Diarrheal diseases are a primary concern. In some settings, there's an elevated risk of cholera. The water-related diseases are certainly often vector-borne, so malaria, dengue, chikungunya. We also have the elevated risk of chronic diseases being exacerbated, and then the molds that grow over time and having to deal with all of the impacts on respiratory systems. And then finally, it's really all of this is associated with the loss of access to basic services, water, sanitation. Any of the markets may be shut down for quite a while, so access to basic hygiene materials. And then health systems are disrupted and may not be able to get to the healthcare facilities if they are standing. So it really not only is there a dramatically increased risk of health impacts, but then trying to cope with those health impacts with every system disrupted. And then very quickly, I wanted to just show some pictures from some of the responses that I've been on. Again, this is in the Philippines, and it's very typical that densely populated, low-income households are located in the most disaster-prone areas. And this is right along the coast where this was a heavy fishing community. It wasn't necessarily legal to build there, but people did, and nobody pushed them out. But they were completely inundated by the storm surge, and were very quickly rebuilding there because they could afford to, because they couldn't afford any other place, actually. And then the impacts on livelihoods. This was from earlier this year in Peru. These were rice fields, rice paddies that were completely inundated, destroyed for this year. But it can, so not only agricultural fields, but also livestock are often killed. Businesses are shut down for a certain period of time, trying to get commodities back in. It just is a complete disruption of systems. And also when people are displaced, especially the vulnerable populations, they now can't get to their place of business. In the case of the Philippines, the fishermen, when they were evacuated to what were thought to be, better housing, it was actually quite a distance from where they had been working. So suddenly they were cut off from their livelihoods. And then something we don't talk as much about, but in many of the heavy flood, there are landslides too. So this was in Bosnia in 2014. We don't typically respond in Eastern Europe, but this was, again, beyond the capacity of the government to respond itself. A lot of European nations came to support, and the U.S. government did as well, because there was not only, this was a river flooding event, but also the landslides that just took whole sides of hills down, along with it all the houses. So just below this house to the left were about 150 households that were no longer habitable because they were clinging to moving land and were not deemed safe. And then overall, and I'll be wrapping up with this slide, massive challenges. The number one being logistics. How do you get the basic support commodities in when the road, airport infrastructure is destroyed? It may be completely blocked by a lot of debris. Very common. So first you have to clear the roads. You have to be able to get basic flights in, helicopters in. This was within, I think, the first week in the Philippines, and that's the airport behind it that was almost completely destroyed. So it was really only military flights that initially were able to get in and bring in relief commodities. So as much as we can get pre-positioned supplies in the most vulnerable areas, that is a good disaster risk reduction, but it can be hard to judge. You don't know exactly where a storm is going to strike until just before it hits. But also, it's good to remember that it's not just about the infrastructure in WASH. We tend to get associated with just getting the water and sanitation supplies up and running again, but it's really all the life, all the behaviors around getting those systems up and running again that make the difference. And it takes time. So there are definitely phases in a response, that immediate response of trying to get people safe, trying to get the basic systems to them, water, safe sanitation, basic hygiene materials, health systems opened again, and basic shelter in place. But then the longer term, the really necessary rebuilding of the lives, that is going to take months and years to really get stabilized again. And it takes working closely with our development partners, which is something we have a really hard time doing, I will admit. And that's something that we continue to try to figure out. but we're often working in different places at different times. So trying to do whatever we can to create those links is critical. And that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I have lots of questions, but I'm just going to ask you one. And I was quite taken at the very start of your comments. You talked about being proactive and reactive, and you say that most of what you do is being reactive. Could you talk a little bit more from a WASH perspective in terms of dealing with too much water? What can we do to be more proactive? What's working? Where can we be successful? What do we need to think of doing more of? Where can we scale up? Talk about that part of our work a little bit.
Well, I would say apart from WASH, it's really looking at where those vulnerable populations are. And so
where they're located.
Where they're located. Because if they continue to be right along the river's edge, right along the shores, they're going to stay vulnerable. And you can raise systems up, you can reinforce wells, you can put in heavier infrastructure, but that land will still remain vulnerable.
Great, thank you. So I'm pleased now that we can move to another colleague, Anita Van Breda, a colleague, a partner, and a friend, who is the Senior Director of Environment and Disaster Management at the World Wildlife Fund. She has more than 20 years' experience in conservation and disaster management, and she leads WWF's work supporting environmentally responsible disaster recovery, reconstruction, and risk reduction, looking at questions around policy, development, operations, and training, and most recently was instrumental in the development of WWF's Green Recovery and Reconstruction, a training toolkit for humanitarian aid. So Anita, welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thank you to the Sustainable Water Partnership for inviting us to participate. And I think maybe I'll start with an answer to Roger Mark's question about what can be done. One thing that can be done is look at the natural and nature-based green guide to flood management. Just for those who are not familiar with WWF, we're a global environmental conservation organization. The headquarters for the U.S. is here in Washington, D.C. I've been with WWF since 2002. And I manage our environment and disaster management program. We are part of our climate change adaptation and resilience team. And as Roger Mark said, we started this work with our Green Recovery and Reconstruction Training Toolkit, which we developed with the American Red Cross. And we try to apply our work to practice on the ground in the field, on the front lines, and then take that learning and apply it to policy issues as well as emerging issues. And it's the emerging issues interests that got us involved with natural and nature-based flood management work. So we know that floods are increasing in scale and scope all around the world. And we know that in a world of a changing climate, extreme events around water-related issues are likely to scale up in scope, sadly. And so a few years ago, USAID, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, asked us to write a guidebook on how to use natural and nature-based methods for flood management. The intended audience for this guidebook is an international one, and the types of partners and clients and grantees that OFDA typically works with. The guide was launched in May of this year. We have a growing number of case studies that are telling some of the stories of how these methods can be used. And we're now in the process of developing a training program to support the use of the guide. The guide itself is a free and open source available online on our knowledge management platform. The guide is based on this framework, which has a number of stages and steps. I'm not going to go through all of them today. This is all available in the guide. But just briefly, what it does, what we're hoping it will do is support users to, in stage 1, go through a preliminary analysis, a contextual analysis of the area of interest and a process to understand what the flood risk is. And through all of these stages and steps, we have tools, checklists, matrices to help the user gather information and organize it in a way that will help them make decisions and set their flood management objectives. After they've done that contextual analysis and risk analysis, they would move on to stage 2, which is looking at a range of different methods that might be possible and appropriate in that place, and being clear about what the flood management objectives are. Then you would move on to stage 3, which would dig deeper into the selection of particular methods, what are the cost implications, the feasibility implications, et cetera, the design implications. And then move on to stage 4, which is really dealing with operation, monitoring and maintenance plans and getting that right. And the maintenance of various flood methods is a key issue in the success or failure of the approaches. And then moving on to 5, which is project evaluation and either decisions to close these projects or revise them or update them, and then go back. It's a circular process. Go back and understand, has the context changed? Has the environmental conditions changed? Have the political or governance issues changed? And what does that mean for our flood management objectives, and how can we make adjustments? The guide's based on 6 principles. I'm not going to read them all, but just to say that we emphasize that not all flooding is bad, that flooding serves certain purposes that are beneficial to humans, and so we want to maximize the positive benefit of flooding and minimize or eliminate the negative or the risk. We try to promote a watershed approach, looking upstream and downstream at what different conditions and issues are. And then flood disaster response, we want to make sure includes disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation as a part of the response process. There are 29 methods described in the Flood Green Guide, organized here. I'm not going to read them all, don't worry. But we wanted to include both hard or traditional gray engineering methods as well as soft or green methods, because that is the reality of most places, most communities. There's usually a combination of methods, and so we wanted to make sure we include that as part of this process, recognizing that if we can use some of the green or environmentally natural nature-based methods, it most likely will decrease the amount of traditional or hard gray engineering that's required. So in most instances, it's a combination of methods that will be required. But we also want to promote strongly the idea of using non-structural methods first. Land use planning, governance, policy, try to use those first. If that doesn't work or that's not sufficient, then soft or green methods. And then lastly, if you have to and you really need to, use more of the traditional gray engineering methods. So we're encouraged to see more and more references made to natural and nature-based methods as part of a suite of options for flood management overall. This is a report that just came out a few days ago from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers here in the U.S., detailing a long list of potential options and highlighting some of the green or natural methods as part of that process. Of course, we know that the Dutch have pioneered many of these methods with their room for the river approach, but we're seeing it now more in the U.S. and other places internationally. And so the focus has moved from a control of flood in all instances to more management that requires a certain amount of flexibility and adaptation as part of that process. This is an example from a disaster response from Superstorm Sandy in New York, where the Rebuild with Design work from Kay Orff at Columbia University using Oyster as part of the infrastructure for managing different risk on a coastline. So it's just a good example of combining ecology, engineering, infrastructure, as well as cultural issues, and really focusing on the multiple benefits that we can try to derive from the integration of these types of methods. And then we want to also focus on learning and adapting. If we're not learning, we're not practicing adaptation. And so we need to take advantage, if you will, of these unfortunate events and really learn what are some of the root causes, how can we modify and adapt practices in order to improve for the future. And then just, if I still have time, Roger, Mark, some observations and recommendations that have been derived from the last few years of working on flood issues. This is a photo from Colombia and Macoa, where they've had floods and landslides, and the WWF team there has done some work on analysis and future planning for the reconstruction there. But overall, we've come to some conclusions about the use of terminology. So green infrastructure, we hear green infrastructure. That can mean different things to different people. We did an internal reference document on green infrastructure. There's 8 different terms: resilient infrastructure, bioengineering, natural infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, just a call for all of us to be clear about the definitions and the scope of the terms that and the approaches that we're using. Secondly, that we don't want to oversimplify green infrastructure. It's not just a matter of business as usual conservation equals green infrastructure. We really need to think about the framework and the design of these methods for risk reduction objectives. It can take time to see the functionality of green or natural methods as compared to hard engineering, where it's supposed to work as soon as the construction is finished. So we have to factor that into design. We need more systematic studies of the testing and efficacy of these different natural methods in order to better understand how we can advance into the future. And then there's a challenge around the standardization. And in the engineering world, in the hard engineering world, there are volumes of standards and metrics that can be used. Not so for some of these natural methods, so the comparison is often difficult. We're encouraged to see a number of different groups moving forward on the idea of setting standards for natural and green infrastructure. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is working on them. The UN, the World Bank, and Deltares in the Netherlands are working on setting some global standards, and we need to work together collaboratively to understand that and contribute to that process. And then in terms of just lastly, who needs to be involved? We all do, and we need to learn how to work together with different sectors. How do engineers work with environmentalists and climate scientists and political scientists and social scientists and urban planners? We need all of this in order to address flood management. And as Melissa said, it's not easy. And so we in WWF are focusing more on collaboration with academic institutions, and we're working with non-traditional academic institutions. We have a partnership right now with Northwestern University with their School of Engineering, where their grad students are working with our interns to integrate these worlds and work together to address collaboration into the future from multiple perspectives. And then lastly, I'll just say we need more research and demonstration sites on these methods. We need physical places where people can go and see what are they, how do they work, what do they look like, in order to develop some confidence that they can be used at a local level. In the absence of physical demonstration sites, we are going to try to experiment with virtual reality to see if that is maybe an alternative or a complementary way to get people used to the idea of using more of these methods. So I will leave it at that. I will say I have one sample copy of the flood guide, but we have more, and we're happy to share. And thank you for your time and your interest.
Thank you very much, Anita. I was taken by your statement. Not all flooding is bad. And I'm sure a lot of people do not have that perspective. And you make the case for natural and nature-based flood management. I'd love to get an example of when flooding has been used in a productive way using natural and nature-based flood management. You did give the example from Rebuild with Design. Could you give us another example? I think a concrete example always helps us remember and resonates.
Well, there's a lot of examples from different systems. So I mentioned also the Room for the River in the Netherlands, making space for water to go where it needs to go or it wants to go, avoiding building in those places, setbacks from the coastline, from river edges, using wetlands, coastal areas, marshes, mangroves as part of the buffer, separating people from where the water is going. So there's examples of using wetlands as a collection place for excess water, and then, like I said, trying to develop or derive multiple benefits. So you get biodiversity value out of that. You can associate it with livelihoods. There are small examples all over the world, but that is one of our challenges, is finding them and bringing that story to the community and doing more sharing and learning on that. So events like this are really important, and I'm very excited to participate because we do need to share those examples.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to George Hawkins, who serves as Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of DC Water. And this sounds amazing. He's transforming DC Water into an innovative, customer-oriented enterprise and is implementing the $2.6 billion Clean Rivers project to nearly eliminate combined sewer overflows, investing $950 million to reduce nutrients for the Chesapeake Bay, and finishing a $470 million waste-to-energy program to produce a marketable nutrient and generate 13 megawatts of green power. Wow. Tell us more.
I got the call. It was a Sunday night. I was on the bat phone. Always have the bat phone. And I was living in the Navy Yard at the time. And I looked out my window. I had floor-to-ceiling window in the building I was in and looked north towards the Capitol because the call was, we've got a terrible flooding problem in Bloomingdale. The interesting thing was that it wasn't raining at all in the Navy Yard. So I was looking out my window, looking north, and it looked biblical that night. It was a reddish, dark sky. I was expecting a tornado or see the Wicked Witch floating around outside. So I ran downstairs and hopped in my car to drive to site, thinking along the way of note to self, maybe I should get a different car when I'm driving into a flood, because I was in a Volt. I did silently proceed north. And by the time I got up to Rhode Island Avenue, right at First Street, got out of my car and ran up. We had about 6 feet of water in the street. That was one of these 4 flooding events in the summer of 2012, each of which flooded that neighborhood and surrounding areas pretty significantly. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood with the council member from that ward. I went into one unit. We had flooding in something like 400 homes that particular flood, although we'd had a whole series of them. So some folks that had been flooded, had repaired, had been flooded, had repaired, had flooded, had repaired, and flooded again. So it was just devastating to them. But what happens in these floods in the district and 755 other cities that have this particular design of a sewer system, which at the time it was constructed in the 1880s, was state-of-the-art and was a heck of a lot better than what had been there before, which was virtually nothing, which is called a combined system. This part of the city is in the combined sewer part of Washington, D.C., which means the sewers that are out in the street, there's a main line right underneath Pennsylvania Avenue, takes the connection, the sanitary connection from all these buildings and this runoff from the storm drains into the combined sewer. When these were built, it was incredibly important to the hygiene of the city. In the 1880s, one of the biggest problems cities had across the country was horse manure, because everybody moved everywhere by horses, and there was horse manure everywhere. And a rain event cleaned the streets and cleaned them into the storm drain, which went into these combined sewers, which moved it out to the rivers. Not a great thing today, but in comparison to having it all around us where we were living in the time, it was a vast improvement. What happened in Bloomingdale and many other neighborhoods is that these combined sewers, and they're huge, the Northeast Boundary Trunk Sewer, which goes underneath Florida Avenue all the way across the city from Bloomingdale down to the Anacostia, starts at 7 feet in diameter, interior diameter, and ends up at 22 feet interior diameter. Brick arch, beautifully built. And they're huge. They're semicircular, gigantic sewers. The semicircle of this have a flat edge on either side and then a little lip at the bottom. That lip at the bottom is where all the sewage flows. The entire rest of that 22-foot structure, or 7 to 22 feet, is all for stormwater. But what happens in a big storm, when it's not totally the quantity over, it's the quantity in time frame that's the challenge. If we got 2 inches of rainfall over a day, we're fine. If we get 2 inches of rainfall in a half an hour, we're flooded. That's what happened in this event. We had about 2 inches of rainfall in a half an hour. All that stormwater flows into that pipe. It fills, and it actually becomes pressurized like a water main. So it starts pushing flow backwards because the pipe itself is flowed. So much force is coming in off the storm drains that it provides pressure, and it was pushing flow back up the sewer laterals into people's basements, or it popped off manholes, shot them into the air about 10 feet, which is pretty dangerous. It's like a projectile. And then that flow is coming in the storm drain, pushing into the pipe, and then shooting back out the manhole and flooding the streets. That was the velocity and the volume. And in one particular home that I looked at that night, I went to many, but the one I remember the most, had pushed flow back up the sewer main, sewer lateral into the basement, had blown out the pipe because the pressure was so high, put a hole in the side of the wall, had filled up the basement, and had lifted up all the furniture and floated all the furniture, the doorways on either end, as the flow started going out the doors of the basement. The toughest public meeting I've ever done, and I've done hundreds of them, was the next week in the basement of a church in that neighborhood. There had been such pervasive flooding. There was now incredible damage, and it's not just physical damage. It's obviously all the mold and mildew that comes along with it, which is a tremendous long-term health challenge, along with, of course, the more deadly immediate diseases that you see in many countries, of what we were going to do about it. The response, today I'll never forget. It's one of the things I love about DC Water. When I joined DC Water, I'd never worked for a utility and only ever agitated, regulated, and sued them. And then all of a sudden I was running one, quite the change. But one of my favorite lessons about utilities is that for us, when you look at the 5 stages, I love your book, you go almost immediately to stage 4. We are expected to build something. The fix comes to us. Planning, all that's nice. What are you going to do, and how fast are you going to do it? And the pressure to do something at the end of an emergency is enormous. And of course, the trick is getting as many people involved as possible and doing something smart while there's this enormous pressure to do anything at all. And one of my favorite memories of my entire time at DC Water was getting everybody together in a room. We have stories of flooding in DC that go back more than a century, because obviously natural systems flood when there's a lot of rain and it can't be absorbed into the ground. I called the team together. I said, I'm the lawyer in the room. I have no idea how to solve this other than solve this. And that's when utility people are their happiest. Give them a terrible problem, tell them to solve it. Their eyes sort of like spin like a cartoon, and they have at it. The solutions are all expensive, and they are on every front. I'll just run it through really quickly. We had a short-term set of solutions, which was one, to put in backwater valves in every home that had a problem. That keeps the flow from going backwards. It goes, essentially the valve closes, so the flow can't go into the basement and explode. You're still going to have overhand flooding, but that will stop that sewage back. We didn't typically do that. We subsidized backwater valves in anyone who asked in the neighborhoods where they existed. Second, we provided engineers who walked the streets, helping with overland flooding. So what could each one of these units do to reduce the level of flooding as it rose in the street? You sort of watch it in your neighborhood of seeing it coming up. What could you do to inhibit from coming into your home? Turns out all the older residents in the neighborhood, if you go through Bloomingdale or a lot of neighborhoods, you'll see that there's a few steps up and then back down to go into the door or into the basement. People wonder, how come? That was because there's been flooding in this neighborhood for a century. In the old days when units were built, They built a little dam right on the front so that the water would stop at the stairs. The new developments didn't realize that. In these brand new buildings, you'd have a walkway that went right into the door. It actually was providing a little canal for that flooding to go right into the institutions. Fascinating how past history had been a guide. In this medium term, we took some old sand filters that are at mill and reservoirs sitting empty, and we relined them. And stormwater that now would go into the streets are bypassed and go and fill up these sand filters to hold it in place in the peaks of the storm. And the third, we also did green infrastructure. So we are doing tremendous amount of green infrastructure in the city, more than $150 million investment. We have performance measures. We do analysis with models to identify where, how, when, quantities we expect, and then we build it and monitor it. So we have a lot of good places here if you're interested in the urban context for capturing stormwater. The challenge of using green infrastructure is quantity. We commit to quantities of capture, just total number, how much do we want to capture? And it is very hard to get the scale of quantity that you need in an urban context just because of scale. When you have that much rainfall and you see millions of gallons of flow, green infrastructure saturates. And actually, it's the second and third day of a storm. Green infrastructure already has absorbed pretty much what it's going to absorb. And you have that second day or third day of storm, its efficacy drops dramatically. So we're building giant tunnels. Our tunnels are mammoth. It's the largest public works project in D.C. since the building of Metro. In fact, our chief engineer helped build Metro tunnels. These are deeper than Metro and bigger than Metro. The tunnel boring machines that we're using to build these tunnels are more than a football field in length, if you can imagine that. They're 1,200 tons. They're 23 feet in diameter, and they're 10 to 15 stories underground, working 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. These tunnels are enormous. We've completed the first two phases, I'm happy to say, on time and under budget, which is almost unheard of. In tunneling engineering, they're also extraordinarily expensive. I'll end it there. There's so much to be said about what can be done. There are regulations in D.C. that are quite stringent. Every new development has to handle 1.2 inches of rainfall on site. You've got to put those structures in place. Our buildings now are built, D.C. Water, we build for 250 minimum. We are putting a 500-year flood wall at the back end of our facility. One of these storms is going to head up the Potomac one of these days, and then we're going to see the kind of storm surge. The costs are extraordinary. I can't quite imagine how this is done in less developed countries when the challenge of funding it in a city as vibrant and as economically strong as Washington is. I've tripled rates. Those of you who are ratepayers know that directly, and it's an enormous challenge. So I just can't imagine the challenge that this faces to places that don't have the economic vitality that we have, because it's hard enough here. But I'll conclude at that point and look forward to the rest of the panel.
Wow, so very insightful. So George, what do we need to stop doing now that is really exacerbating the problem? What is most urgent in terms of what we need to rectify now?
My reaction is somewhat in D.C. and certainly in other cities. I've been to Houston. We've provided some assistance. We regularly send crews. We sent crews up to New Jersey during Superstorm Sandy, down to Florida. And it's a very, very hard thing to do, but it is one of the most important, which is to curtail rebuilding in areas that are prone to flooding. It is just sinking so much time and effort in a place where you rebuild in the place that floods. It's going to flood again. And even if you build smarter the second time, we're starting to see this in jurisdictions where homeowners or business owners are being bought out because that's actually cheaper than the constant level. And the flood insurance system in some ways has created incentives to build in the places where we don't need it. And those kinds of big planning questions, I have operational needs. I've got to fix things, build things, but the planning of making sure we're not building in the wrong places, to me, is the single best thing we can do in the short run to reduce the consequence of these storms.
Great, thank you. We now go on to Eric Viola, who is the director of Windrock International's USAID-funded Sustainable Water Partnership. He's a French-American civil engineer with 25 years of international experience in water resource irrigation engineering and has worked in a number of countries, including Bangladesh, Egypt, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Morocco. So Eric, welcome.
Thank you. So being French, I'm going to start with Bastille Day. but that's not a funny story. Bastille Day, 1987, just 20 kilometers from my hometown, basically just below the ski resort where I learned to ski. There was camping, and during the night, there was a thunderstorm, and there was a flood that killed 23 people. That was, of course, a shock. And as always, among grieving relatives, among journalists, the question is, what should have been done, what can be done, and who is responsible? Okay. Pakistan 2010, I'm sure everybody has heard of that one. About 20 million people had to move because of the floods that lasted the entire monsoon. But that's one we remember, but it's only one of a series of events that have happened in the last 20 years. The impact of that one was of course massive in terms of people that were displaced. Casualties, several thousand people were killed. In terms of the economic impact, 20 million acres were flooded and damaged, crops. Over 1 million livestock were killed, and that's also significant. So that's a kind of event we are dealing with. And just a quick list of similar events. China in the summer of 1998. There was in summer 2007 all over the United Kingdom. For those who follow the news in Australia, about 7 years ago, 2010. And of course, the recent hurricanes, Harvey and Irma, all those are events that grab the news for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and then we forget about it. So one difference, between, George was talking about economic vitality. One difference between UK, Australia, and the US, and for example, Pakistan, is the impact, okay? You have on one side economies that can recover pretty fast, and you have on the other hand populations who are always on the brink. Basically, you're dealing with subsistence farmers. They're always on the brink of hunger and disease, and when the floods come, well, they are straight into it. Relief comes, Melissa talked about that, and usually, at the time in 2010 in Pakistan, there was a lot of complaining from Pakistan, a lot of call for aid, and of course donors stepped in, and some was done, of course never enough according to Pakistan, but some was done. But the issue is that I was looking in the news if anybody 7 years after has looked at the long-term impact. For example, 20 million people moved during the floods. How many went back to their villages? How many stayed in refugee camps? How many ended up in the slum cities of Karachi, Islamabad, and other places? That's the kind of thing nobody looks into. Very quickly, because I'm a civil engineer and I need to go through a couple of technical things for awareness raising. We need to keep in mind that there are different types of river floods, okay? You have flash floods, like the one that happened close to my hometown in 1987. You have the regular overbank river flooding. It rains a lot upstream, and the river goes up over the levees or embankments, or just floods all the floodplains. And you have pluvial flooding, like George described. It rains very hard in the center of a town, and basically the storm of the sewers cannot accommodate it. Or in many places, George mentioned that too, there are many places where you don't have any system. If you go to Sana'a in Yemen, you don't have any system because they don't have thunderstorms. I mean, most of the time. And then once in a while, they have a massive one and everything floods. And actually, in Sana'a, they have actually turned some of the streets are the sewers. I mean, are the storm of drains. That's how it operates. And maybe economically it makes sense, because why would you spend more money if it happens only once every 25 years? But still, it's dangerous, kills people, does a lot of damage. And because it's only every 25 years, everybody forgets about it. So how to mitigate? Very quickly, as usual, and Anita described a similar framework, you go through an assessment stage, you identify vulnerability, and then you try to quantify damages, because at the end of the day, you need to compare costs and benefits. One thing I want to mention, especially on assessing hazards, and George talked about the good old days, looking at data. There are many places around the world where you don't have data. Well, you don't have written data. You don't have numbers. but you have knowledge. And it's very sad to say that in many, many places that knowledge is not tapped into. I'll give a quick example. 20 years ago, I was hired by Total, who was building a very large refinery in Iran. And they were building it on the coast, very far from any urban center. It was 100 kilometers south of Bushehr. And there's nothing around. And at some point, one engineer said, well, from those hills just behind the refinery, does it rain sometimes? Okay, it's very hot, it's very arid. So they asked me to come over and have a look. And I said, well, yeah, I think it rains once in a while, the limited data there is. And I talked to the fisherman village next door, and they said it rains. And actually, once in a while, there's a big flash flood, and you're straight in front of the largest wadi, or stream, that exists 100 kilometers north to south along the coast. So you've chosen the worst possible spot. So can you move the refinery? No way. We have 25 million investment. We are not moving. Okay, well, you have excavators, so we'll have to build a pretty wide channel to divert the floods. At that point, you know, there's no data. I mean, I went trekking into that wadi. I looked at the geology of and the topography of the wadi. And it's like a detective job. The only clues you have is the size of that channel, is people, local knowledge. So you talk to villagers, you ask them, and you try to see what has happened in the past and what is the magnitude of that, the extent of that. No data, no numbers, okay? And you try to come up, at the end of the day, you need numbers, because if you want them to build a levee and to build a channel, well, you're an engineer, you have to give some numbers, some meters, how deep, how wide, etc. So that's a kind of situation you're dealing with. But the point I want to make here is that, unfortunately, nowadays, we spend so much time using computer models, and there's not enough calibrating or ground truthing of those approaches, and especially indigenous local knowledge is not tapped into enough, and in all those places. And I've been to so many places where after a flood, people say, well, an old person, an old lady would say, oh, well, when I'm 80-year-old, when I was 6-year-old, I remember there was a big flood, 2 meters in my house, and nobody has asked me. And the realtor over there, they did these bungalows, foot in the water bungalows, and well, if they had asked me, I would have told them, this is crazy, you don't build there. So that's the kind of thing we need to look into to assess what are the vulnerability in terms of exposure and sensitivity. So the usual step after that is to do flood mapping, you know, maps that show where it's going to flood and how deep it's going to be. And you can see the one on the right, it shows different levels of flooding for a specific design flood. Another criteria to keep in mind is not just the depth of flooding, it's also the speed. I'll talk more about that, but the damage depends on the depth, but sometimes also on the speed. Well, when you have a flash flood, it's of course speed that's killing people. Range of solution. Well, Anita did an excellent job going through the range of solutions, so I will just very quickly mention, you know, what covers the same thing, but very quickly: green infrastructure policies, warning systems. I think what's just the point I wanted to make, and Anita said it, she said we need to train people. I've worked in 25 developing countries. I've sat in several ministries of water. You're dealing with civil engineers. Okay, you only dealing with civil engineers. I'm a civil engineer too. And actually, when I was trained 25 years ago, the only thing I know how to do is to design and build concrete. That's all I know how to do. So when you're asking those engineers who are in charge of water management, nobody else is in charge. They are in charge. It's an engineering issue. Everybody knows that. So you pass it to the water engineers and they do something. They cannot look at anything else but gray infrastructure. And we need to change that thinking and that knowledge. We need to raise awareness. We need to provide success stories, like Anita said. We need to provide standards, and some already exist. But we really have to do much better in terms of changing mentalities there, okay? Because otherwise, you know, a flood comes, damn, in both senses of the word. You know, that's all they can think of. That's all they know. Everything else, dealing with people, whoa. A public meeting, George was talking about a public meeting. First time I was in a public meeting as a young engineer, it's not easy. in front of people, and it was actually a flood issue after the flood. And of course, the mayor who had hired us to do the job, he was sitting at the back. We were in the front. So you have very upset people. And George, I'm sure, can tell us lots of stories about that. But again, engineers in those developing countries, they are not trained to deal with people. They don't want to to deal with people. It's scary. It can be dangerous sometimes. You can get shot. So again, that's something we need to look into. One big question about, several questions actually, about what flood management, several key questions we need to ask ourselves. First of all, what do we protect? Do we protect cities? Do we protect rural areas? In developed countries, it's pretty easy. We developed towns, the center of towns. We don't protect rural areas most of the time. There are some exceptions. But usually it's not worth spending money to protect farmlands and etc. Most of the time. And if you protect them to a small level, like the 10-year flood. You don't go much beyond that. But when you're looking at places like Bangladesh, it's just a delta. Basically, everybody's in a flooded area. And everybody lives in a small village. So apart from a few big towns, it's all rural areas. Well, either you protect them or you don't protect them. Well, each time there's a flood in Bangladesh, and that was my first job 25 years ago, after the big floods of 88 and 91, well, people die over there. So you may want to do something with rural areas. But always the first issue is what to protect. The second issue is at what level? What level of risks are we willing to tolerate? And the last question, oops, I went too fast. And the last question is who pays for it? Because the more you protect, the more expensive it is. The curve on the right basically shows at the bottom, it's the probability of the flood. As you go towards the left, okay, you're basically increasing the rarity of the event, okay? When you see 0.1 is the 10-year flood. It means that flood every year has a 10% chance of occurring. 0.01, 100-year flood, it means it has a 1% chance of occurring on any given year. And people say the 100-year flood, well, it happens once every 100 years. No, that's not how probabilities work. And also, it's interesting how 100-year has been chosen in many places has the design flood. Not always, but in many places, especially in flood protection of cities, it's 100-year flood because it's more than a generation. It's more than most of our lifespan, so it's kind of beyond us. So it's easy to take 100 years. And people forget that basically in a century, that event has 65% chance of occurring. So it will probably happen and you will probably see it. But all these questions, that's the question we need to ask ourselves. And the last point I want to make here is that those questions are not debated publicly, even in our countries, and definitely not debated publicly in developing countries. And they should, because there's a cost. So what's the future of flood management? The first thing to mention is that when we say several thousand people died in Pakistan in 2010, that seems like a lot. Well, in China, in the 30s, they had 3 floods in less than 10 years that killed hundreds of thousands of people. River floods. I'm not talking about tsunamis or coastal floods, okay? So we've made a lot of progress. We are able to warn people. We are able to bring relief faster because, people drown, but then people also die in the weeks after the event from everything, disease, lack of food, etc. So we've made a lot of progress. But the thing we need to keep in mind is that in Pakistan in 2010, when people looked at the event, they said, oh, wow, what happened was so unique. A combination of early monsoon, a snow melt. It was really unique. I mean, it's just like something that happens once in a long while, okay? Now, 7 years after, they're saying, well, the monsoon in the Southeast Asia is changing, and that may happen more and more often. And I think at the end of the day, the big question beyond, in terms of the level of protection is what do we protect, what don't we protect? Going back to my hometown example, there was, of course, some judicial investigations after what happened. 23 people were killed, and could that have been prevented or not? Well, the first ruling was that it was an act of God. It was so massive, nobody could have predicted it. Then there was a second ruling, and now we are talking 10 years after the fact, that said, well, no, looking into the archives, in 1880-something, there was another flood that was, from what we can read from the archives, there was something that was comparable. So somebody should have looked into that, and somebody should have done something. So the government, the French government, and the town were fined and had to pay compensation to the relatives of the victims. But at the end of the day, are we willing to accept act of God, or do we always want to put somebody as responsible for what happens? Again, what risk are we willing to tolerate? Risk cannot disappear, it can only be mitigated. Just a few things to keep in mind. Floods are going to still be there and still be a big issue. And there are two trends that I'm sure most of you know that will make floods more and more relevant, and these are first, climate change. And what's interesting with climate change is that you have many places around the world where communities have learned to live with floods. Okay, I mentioned Bangladesh. I was a month ago in Cambodia around the Tonle Sap Lake in the center of Cambodia. You have communities who've lived for generations around the lake that goes up and down by several meters every year. And they make a living out of it, fishing, growing crops, etc. They know how to deal with it. What they don't know how to deal with is climate change. Suddenly, the flood behaves differently. Comes earlier, comes later, comes higher, comes lower. And as much as they have traditional knowledge to deal with regular patterns, they don't have any experience, they don't have any knowledge to deal with those changes. And that's an issue. And the other issue, I think Anita mentioned that several times, and Melissa too, is poor communities, population growth. Each time I mention that, it's a bit the elephant in the room, but population growth, people need a living, people move into areas where they shouldn't live, and they are in search of a living. In Bangladesh, again, you have 2 million people living on chars. Chars are basically sandbars that appear at the end of the monsoon and disappear once the river goes up. So these people move around, and these people live in areas that are prone to erosion and to flooding, and they are basically surviving. I'll pass on that. All I want to mention here is that we have, we at the Sustainable Water Partnership, which is the flagship program of USAID on water security, we have a website, which I invite you to visit, and we are coming up with a series of toolkits to address the overall theme of water security and how to improve it, not just for flood, but the too much theme, the too little, the too erratic, the too dirty. And we have a process, and we have some guiding practices, and here it's how they apply to floods. I won't go through that. I don't want to take all the time. But in terms of parting words, always the question is what can be done, what should be done. And at the end of the day, one thing that applies to all of development and especially to floods, we save lives, but do we save livelihoods? And basically floods are one of many factors that keep massive amounts of population in poverty and always on the brink of disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you raised a number of compelling points. So in particular, you talk about the need to engage people, and you talk about that from the point of view of also taking into account historical knowledge and indigenous methods, and thinking about how we engage civil engineers to engage more with people. So you make the point that we need to do it. What are some of your thoughts about how we can do it?
Well, awareness raising, I think, I don't remember if it's Anita or Melissa who said floods are natural processes. Yeah, people forget. If you compare a community that has been living around Tonle Sap Lake or has been living in the Delta in Egypt or in Bangladesh, they are used to floods. Now you put that together with somebody, you compare that to somebody who just bought a house in Bloomingdale in DC, or somebody who just bought a bungalow next to the river and or next to the beach. And those people have no knowledge, no indigenous knowledge that something happened 50 years before and could happen again. And usually realtors, if they are not regulated, they are not going to raise awareness or advertise the fact that, and maybe they don't even know. So I think the first point is to raise awareness that floods occur, that they are natural occurrences, and that there are times when we can mitigate. We cannot control a flood. And I'm glad we are not using flood control anymore. And again, engineers say you can control things, can control nature. You can't control floods. All you can do is mitigate the risk. And at the end of the day, the big debate of what risk are we willing to tolerate, I think it should be more and more a public debate. And what are we willing to pay for? Why should it always be engineers taking those decisions? 100-year flood is a design flood. Why? Why it's not 10, maybe 50 or 500? I mean, it depends how much are people willing to pay and who's supposed to pay. That's a few years back, I did a study for French river basin agencies. Those agencies function with the well-known principle that user pay and polluter pay. So if they want to spend money on a specific topic, for example, flood protection, they need to have an income. How do you generate an income on flood protection? Who are the users of flood protection? Well, everybody. But what we looked into is we said, well, anytime there is a urban development, you're basically paving for a large mall, you're going to increase runoff. So you're going to increase the severity of floods downstream. So maybe you should pay a tax on that. Anytime you build in a floodplain, you're basically reducing the space for flood to expand. So you're basically putting an additional burden on downstream. So should these things be taxed? Well, that's the kind of thinking we need to have again. And again, we need to engage people. It cannot just be a top-down decision.
Great, thank you very much. So now we move to our final panelist, Alexandra Campbell-Ferrari, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation, which is an independent 501c3 dedicated to advancing water security and understanding, evaluating, and innovating in water law internationally. Alexandra, welcome.
Good morning, thank you. And thank you to the SWP and the Wilson Center for hosting this event and inviting me to participate. So I just want to open up first with a question. So who here thinks of law when we think about disaster prevention or disaster response? If you could just raise your hand. Oh, all right. A surprising number of you. So typically when I talk to different people about these issues, when we think about disasters, we're not necessarily thinking about the law. And in fact, oftentimes I think people would argue that the law is prohibiting us or stopping us from actually protecting ourselves from floods. But I think what we need to remember is that the law is an incredibly important proactive tool, not reactive, but proactive tool that we have to reduce the impact of extreme weather events and natural disasters on our communities, our economy, our agricultural production capabilities, and our national security. And not just that, but they're really important for preventing reoccurring damages and wasteful expenditures of money. So why? How is the law actually helping us in preparing for disasters, preventing disasters, or at least preventing the impact of disasters on our lives and livelihoods? So if you take a look at the laws that currently exist across the United States, they range in the approach, in the strength and weakness of the measures that they require. So some laws forbid building in floodplain zones and in coastal zones. Some limit building in flood zones, depending on where you are in the floodplain. Some require notification to home buyers to say, look, you are located in a floodplain. And then if insurance is required, they also require the notification that, yes, if you purchase a home in the floodplain, you're also going to have to buy insurance, and here is the range of costs. And depending on the area, those insurance costs can be very small or very large, also something that we need to think about in terms of incentivizing not moving or living in the floodplain zone. And like I said, they might actually require you or not require you to own flood insurance in these areas. So we also saw in Houston after Hurricane Harvey that Houston did not employ any kind of zoning ordinances and didn't have any rules limiting where you could build or what you could do. And I thought it was really interesting that there was a Washington Post article that was published after the hurricane that came out pretty strongly against the fact, or at least pointing a finger at the fact that the failure and absence to have zoning ordinances in Houston directly resulted in the degree of devastation in Harvey. And it was surprised to see that almost immediately after that, there was a series of articles saying the exact opposite, that, look, you can't blame the zoning ordinances for all the disaster, the degree of the disaster, the fact that it happened. That's just nature. That's an act of God. And I think there's a little bit of a kernel of truth in that. I think for the most part, my immediate response is that, we need to think about what are the policies that we want in place? What are we trying to achieve when we actually put these laws, or what I really think about them as rules? What are we trying to achieve when we put these rules in place? And as Eric was saying, how do we put that risk onto different categories? So what might be some of the purposes of these laws? In other words, essentially, what are we trying to achieve by putting these rules in place, and what is the approach that we want to take as stakeholders and citizens who are impacted by this, as both people living in these communities, but also taxpayers? So there is an economic aspect to this that I think we need to think about. So you can place that risk and responsibility on specific parties. You can just flat out prevent new construction in floodplains. You can punish people for constructing new businesses and new homes in floodplains. You can punish them for continuing to live in those floodplains. So you can require insurance. You can institute a bunch of measures that require certain payments or taxes or insurance requirements if you live in those areas. You can go as far as to forcibly move families and businesses that are located in those floodplains, actually requiring them to move within a certain period of time. You can instead incentivize businesses and families to move. So you can offer to buy them out, buy homeowners out to get them to move from that area. You can take a very hands-off approach, and you can just full-on facilitate the freedom of choice and say, look, it's, here's the risk. It's up to you whether or not you want to live here, but it's your choice. You can think about it really from an economic perspective, and you can say, look, we're gonna completely limit the wasteful expenditures of U.S. taxpayers' money by preventing insurance payouts to homeowners who have received compensation for flood damage in the past. To say, look, you got one chance to realize that your home is in a floodplain, that there's an increasing likelihood due to climate change and other events that this is going to continue to happen, and so we're not going to pay you out anymore. This risk is going to be borne completely by you. You can take the opposite approach of that. You can just say, look, we're going to continue to bail you out as long as possible. We'll help you whenever there's a flood, whatever the damage, whatever the extent of that damage. We can think about this as needing to minimize the physical damage to our infrastructure, from wastewater treatment plants to our energy production facilities to our businesses. We can think about it from that infrastructure perspective. We can think about it as reducing the loss of life and the fact that we don't, in terms of during the actual disaster and then after the disaster. So post-Harvey and post a lot of these hurricane events, as many of the panelists talked about, waterborne diseases are one of the outcomes. Rare parasite-eating, skin-eating, flesh-eating things. All these really nasty kind of diseases. Yes, that stuck out to me after Hurricane Harvey. One of my new fears. We can plan better for urban development, and we can account for that population growth. So we had the engineering perspective and we've had that planning perspective. So thinking about that, thinking about the fact that our populations are going to grow, thinking about urban sprawl, thinking about infrastructure resilience. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't necessarily thought about, even though I know that wastewater treatment plants are gravity-based, is that all these wastewater treatment plants are at the lowest possible points in our communities, and they're going to be one of the first infrastructures affected by flooding. So how do we think about that and not all of a sudden increase the cost of our wastewater treatment plant operations by then having to not have them gravity-fed and put them higher up, but also not wanting to have to rebuild or subject our population to exposure to untreated sewage? How do we account for the margins of error in floodplain map development? So there are margins of errors that make a difference. Do we want to inform our homeowners of that degree of risk? Do we want to just flat out prevent building in floodplains? Do we want to forbid more than one payout? Do we want to protect vulnerable communities? Do we want to target vulnerable communities because they really are the ones that can't jump back from disaster impact as quickly as other communities? Do we want to, something that has recently come out actually in a New York Times article, they talked about the fact that developers took the approach of dumping dirt onto floodplain zones to raise those homes above the floodplains so that they didn't have to tell homeowners that they were in those areas and that they were complying fully with the law. Do we want to prevent those kinds of activities? Do we want to prevent new construction near Superfund sites so that when we do have flooding events and if there is that kind of flooding, that doesn't impact our communities, which we're seeing, which we saw again in Houston. So this is a really, really long list of, I think, what we need to think about and the first step that we need to take in terms of determining what is the purpose of the rules that we're setting. What do we as a community want from the rules that we're putting forth? And I think Eric also mentioned this as well. What are we willing to what are we willing to pay for putting more restrictive rules in place? But versus what are we willing to pay after the fact if we allow greater freedom of choice up front? So this is that age-old question of, look, we can have a really hands-off approach. We can allow you to do what you want to do. You can build where you want to build. Freedom of choice, we're not going to take your property. But when the disaster comes, we're also not going to necessarily be there to bail you out. Or we are going to be there to bail you out because it's a 1% chance or a 1 in 100 years chance. At least that's how it's conveyed. And then who should set these rules? So should it be the federal government? Should it be the state government? Should it be the municipalities? Should it be the counties or provinces? Should it be the watershed? Should it be the river basins? I think there's a real question of who needs to be responsible for setting these rules, especially when those impacts are felt beyond the decision-making jurisdiction. So Moody's recently reported that it's going to, they estimate that it's going to, the recovery from Houston, or the recovery from Harvey in Houston, is going to cost $81 billion. So $81 billion, and that's not being borne by Texas, that's not being borne by the people living in Houston, that's being borne by every taxpayer in the United States. So the decisions that we make at this very local level, even though that seems like a good idea, that we should allow that freedom of choice, even all the way to the property owner, it seems like a good choice, but you're paying for it if you live in New York, if you live in DC, if you live in California, you're paying for the decisions that we make in other jurisdictions. So in terms of when I'm thinking about flood planning, and I'm thinking about disaster prevention and disaster response, my first question is what do we want to do? What are the rules that we want? How much risk do we allocate before and after disasters? And who should make those rules? Who should we consider to be accountable for the decisions? And then who has to pay for that, either before or after the fact? Who has to pay for protecting us from those disasters in advance, or who has to pay for recovering from the disasters once they've happened? So now, after Hurricane Harvey, after the series of hurricanes, and not just in the United States, but across the globe, now is really the perfect time to be asking these questions and exploring these options and really trying to think, what is the approach that we want to take at the community level, and harmonizing that with the approach that we take at the state and federal level, and even at the international level, because the impacts of hurricanes and extreme weather events across the globe have an impact on the U.S. So again, just thinking, how do we harmonize these approaches? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And what are the steps that we want to take? Thank you.
Wow, my head is spinning. You've raised a lot of critical, difficult questions. I think you've given us a little insight into how we could begin to think about addressing these questions. So my challenge is practically, how do we harmonize in the way that you're talking about? What do you see as a logical next step? I mean, you talk a little bit about community engagement. You talk about having a sense of the costs that we will all bear. What concretely, specifically, practically can we do next to help begin to answer all these questions? It's a little overwhelming.
It is, and I listed them as such to actually be overwhelming. So I apologize, but I don't apologize. So Eric stole my thunder a little bit by saying that stakeholder, making this more transparent, not having this in the back door, not having these conversations in that back door with just civil engineers and the doers. I mean, the doers, as George said as well, they are the people that take action to build things and make decisions that are incredibly important. But we as community members need to know what the impact of those decisions have, right? And I don't think we do. I don't think it has really become aware to people in the United States that we want this freedom, right? There are a lot of constituents that believe that decisions should be made at a state and local level. This is a governance issue. Oddly enough, it really is governance. It's a political issue to a certain point, though I hesitate to say that. But it really does, it's this governance issue of who do we want making these decisions. But it's really tough to say, okay, sure, fine, let's leave it to the local levels, because the impacts of those decisions that they make have an impact on people outside of their decision-making jurisdiction. And so I think having these conversations out in the open, raising these questions, I think overwhelming people to say, look, this is a huge issue. You need to think about this. And we might need to make some tough calls to say, look, we need to set a rule that says you cannot build here. I mean, making those tough decisions in this kind of political climate isn't easy. People, and especially when it's our politicians who want to be reelected, that are making these decisions, they're not necessarily making the right decisions for the right reasons. And so we really need our community members to step up and say, this is the community that I want to live in. I don't want to be this impacted by a disaster. And I think that starts with bringing them into the conversation, educating them about these issues, and making these issues transparent to them, including making the law something that's accessible to them. Making the law and planning and all these very complicated, very technical issues something that makes sense to an everyday average citizen.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up. There are lots of points on the table. My colleagues will come to you, raise your hand, give your name, affiliation, and get quickly to your question. So we'll start here, please. We'll start with you and then go to your neighbor.
Hi, I'm Dan Sines from the International Boundary and Water Commission. I think Anita mentioned that one of the first proactive measures should be land use planning. That's so politically difficult in the developing world, it seems. We've talked about in places like the Philippines, people keep returning to these very vulnerable areas. In the country that our commission works in Mexico, you see a similar phenomenon where governments simply cannot or will not prevent squatters from moving into marginal areas. In fact, in Mexico, you see a bit of the reverse, a repeating pattern where people move into these marginal areas and then where they shouldn't really be living at all, and then they demand public services and utilities, and okay, then the electricity moves in and the sanitation moves in. So I don't know, it's such a daunting challenge to prevent that. It's hard enough in Houston and in the United States. Are there examples of success stories in the developing world where people get it, where they've embraced the need to do better land use planning? How can we better engage them?
Thank you. Your neighbor?
Good morning. My name is Julian Kachanoff. I sit in the Office of Canadian Affairs at the State Department. Thanks for a great panel. I kind of wish that we could combine all of you into like a super flood prevention actor, like a Voltron of some sort. There we go. My question is, I guess, related to time frames. It seems as though what we're talking about is cycles that don't seem to line up very neatly. Political cycles, the hydrological cycle, obviously, cycles for budgets, green infrastructure, obviously, is in a completely different time frame than I think what the response, from constituents demands. And so I wonder, sort of, if you had any thoughts on how we should think about structuring our response, both to be aware of those various cycles, but maybe ideally to take advantage of them. I think of the phrase about crisis being a terrible thing to waste, and I wonder, how do you take something that's as significant as a $80 billion flood, and how to use that to change how things play out on the ground? So, thanks.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Judy Oglethorpe with the World Wildlife Fund. And I'd like to ask Eric and George or anybody on the panel who can answer. We've seen all these huge problems and we're thinking back to, what was the historical record, but is anybody actually thinking forward and thinking about future climate scenarios and planning for future floods? And we know that there's a high level of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is greater the further out you go, but infrastructure is being built for, 50 years to come. So is anybody thinking about climate scenarios and changing the risks because of climate change?
Great, thank you. So let's deal with those three questions. I'm going to add another one, and I think a lot of you sort of hinted towards looking at those who are the most vulnerable. We talked about folks on the edge, livelihoods, the poor. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about this from a justice lens. Talk a little bit about the most poor women who may be disproportionately affected, indigenous populations. What are your thoughts on a justice lens on this? So we have a question on land use planning. Any examples of success from the developing world? How can we use the crisis around flooding as an opportunity that ties into different time frames and cycles, political, hydro, green infrastructure, budgetary? What about thinking of future climate scenarios? Who's thinking forward and a justice lens? So one or any of the above. Anita, can we start with you?
Well, they're all great questions, and sadly, I don't have the answer to them all, except that I actually stay up at night thinking about these things too and worrying about them. So it's good to be in a group here and have the chance to talk through it. In terms of land use, I know it's easy to say we should do comprehensive land use planning and everyone should get along and do this happily at the watershed level. There aren't a lot of good examples of that, and it is a political process by and large, and a regulatory and a governance process. We do have one case study in the Flood Green Guide that I thought was a good example. It also comes from the Philippines, where there was a WWF project looking more at climate change and adaptation and agricultural systems, and there was, a disconnect between jurisdictional separation and overlap with a number of different communities that was preventing more of a comprehensive approach. And so they sort of quietly looked for political and governance relationships that were not necessarily about floods or disasters, but there was some mechanism for discussion and collaboration that they were then able to sort of piggyback this issue around water management for a flood risk reduction objective. And I just thought that was a good example of trying to avoid the need to create new and different mechanisms and systems and look for places where you could take advantage of maybe a seemingly unrelated issue to try to facilitate that type of collaboration. And then just quickly on the different time frames and using the response to a disaster. There's nothing like a disaster to focus people's attention. And they do want to get engaged. And disaster survivors are not just passive recipients of aid. They're usually very engaged in what's going to happen in the future. A couple of months ago, I was in Colombia looking at the mudslides and flooding in the Macoa area. And there we talked to local municipalities and community groups about this methodology called Rapid Environmental Assessment, or REA. And they could maybe use that to help with the planning process in response to that disaster. The REA methodology has a very specific community-based module that is really targeting the engagement of community members as well as professionals and engineers and hydrologists and others to put together a comprehensive rapid assessment of environmental issues. And boy, in that community group, when community people said, wait, there's a module just on our engagement, yeah, we want that, because they were complaining about all the experts who had come in qualified technical people, and you need that kind of assessment, but they felt left out of the process, and they felt like they had indigenous knowledge and experience to contribute. And so, if you can support engagement across those spectrums in response to a disaster, you get more participation and engagement. The trick, though, is it's hard to do in a post-disaster situation because there is all that pressure. There's a lot of money or aid or actors that rush in. So, working behind the scenes to understand where are the vulnerability factors, where are the vulnerable communities to certain hazards, and building that capacity to do those sorts of things in advance, I think sets us up for a better, more successful outcome.
And it'll be interesting to see if those communities can use that for some political leverage. Yes. I know some of the communities that we have worked with in the Philippines, when they get the mayors at a municipal level to think about how this is tied to votes, they get some real traction. Yep. So, George?
Sure. I love the timing question because it's one of my biggest feelings on this. I ran a watershed group in New Jersey for 7 years. And what I learned about watershed planning is the subtext of everything you've heard here, which is everybody cares about it, every issue is involved, and it scales big and small in every direction. When Governor Whitman was governor of New Jersey, we had a watershed planning program for the whole state, and it collapsed in abject failure because the planning mechanisms can become so over-process oriented and take so long and involve so many players that with wonderful intentions, and nobody's opinion is wrong and all the information is right, the planning process that they outlined in New Jersey had 7 steps. Implementation was step 7. And as it turned out, 3 or 4 years in, no one had gotten there yet. You can, and it's not good or bad. My predisposition is to act, not just to build gray, but to do something. So I love the rapid scan. We created it. We were guilty of the same thing in my watershed group. We'd spent a lot of time assessing and doing. That's what we were good at. And then what about what we're going to do? We flipped it. My view, and this is not entirely true all the time, but most of the time, is 80% of what you need to know you can find out in a month. The last 20%, every percentage after that is much harder and harder, but the 80% everybody knows. So you can get a pretty rapid set of what are the key issues, where are the key problems, and who are the key people you talk to, and get to a point of knowing the first 5 things you've got to do within 6 months. And then focus on action, because the way you get support, I've found, from the people who need to pay for it or support it, is by things happening that they can take credit for. Invite the mayor, invite the council, have them actually doing something in the community, and it starts creating a positive feedback loop. And the risk in this area, because it's true, is there's so many questions, so many players, and so much scale that you can end up doing that fruitfully, but without action for almost as long as you want. And so I'm predisposed to this anyways, but I found it works. Second, it's not an example internationally. I don't have good examples from that, but we were running a watershed planning program in New Jersey trying to change zoning based on stormwater. And the first time we went into municipalities where there is zoning power, we were suggesting that we were going to suggest to those municipalities what they needed, and in some respects grade their ordinances. Total failure. What municipality or country wants to be graded by someone else? That's almost always bad, because someone's going to say what you haven't done. So we flipped it. And this was an idea of one of my employees, so I claim no credit, although it was phenomenally successful. We sent a questionnaire to the town councils in central New Jersey and asked them what they wanted in their towns. We got these answers, and they never said the wrong thing. No one said, we want flooding, no, they all said good things. And so then we wrote a report back to them and said, here's what you said you wanted. And we're now going to compare what you wanted to what your ordinances say to see if it matches up. Because it turns out in almost no case did the ordinances say what the council said they wanted. But then the comparison wasn't to our grading system, it was to their intention. And then we issued a report that was called the Next Steps Report. Never a gap analysis, never negative. You've taken a lot of good steps, here's the next one. And it outlined, you said you wanted this, here's what your ordinance says, here's a practical step with riparian protection, with zoning based on nitrate dilution, with infiltration that you can do to match up your zoning to what you want, and let's celebrate when you put in ordinances that match up to your goal. And we had municipalities lining up for that. So it was only because we failed so spectacularly the first time through that we revised it. And we did it on both. We did watershed planning. It was too long and too intensive and evolved to a rapid scan. And we did grading and reviews that failed, and we evolved to this asking what folks want, and it was remarkably successful.
It's very inspiring. One thing I wanted to ask you, when you were speaking earlier, you talked about being in the community, and you said they were flooded and prepared, and you said that a number of times. And it made me think, do you ever hear from these communities, we're tired of being flooded and prepared? I hear communities tell me we're tired of being resilient. So do you get that? How do you deal with that?
Gosh, we get it all the time. The reality of running a utility is that it's always our fault, almost no matter what we do. Yes, they're tired of being. Here's the good point, though, and you're right. A disaster is a terrible thing to waste. Because of that flooding in Bloomingdale, we instituted a $250 million project. The city helped fund it. It was because of the need of the day, short-term planning. We knew what we wanted to do, short, medium, and long. We've implemented three of the four main mechanisms. In the last big storm we had this past summer, all flooding all over the city, no flooding in Bloomingdale. So it can work. But we know we're going to get it every time, and it's just the reality of the day. I wish I had some wisdom on that other than to take it and try to use it as a motivation to do something.
Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I think these are fabulous responses, so I'm not sure I can add too much more. I do have a couple of examples that come to mind. I'm certainly much more involved in the response than the disaster risk reduction. But the Philippines, which the 7,000 islands that make up the Philippines are the most disaster prone from storms. And so there's been a lot of work there, and you keep hearing it come up. Post Typhoon Haiyan, there was a concerted effort to bring together the communities, the government, looking at where the most vulnerable were. There was immediately a 40-meter setback that was created as a no-build zone that almost simultaneously was ignored. I can't say what's happening today there, but I'm almost positive that 40-meter was not adhered to. And so it meant populations are back in there because of both the political pressure and the economic pressure of those most vulnerable populations trying to get their lives back. So it's very challenging. And while I love the example of the 7 years and things falling apart afterwards, it does take time. So that momentum that's generated, it's not going to be solved, though, in the first 6 months, which I think it was mentioned over here. We never do enough in a response because we can't alleviate all the damage that was done immediately. It does take some time, but it takes really strong facilitation. And whether it's coming from the utility or an NGO or the government, it takes that ongoing effort to stay with it and get those quick fixes, get things started. And the examples that I see most often are around canals. So many developing areas, whether it's for irrigation or just for stormwater runoff, very basic canals that are most often completely clogged by trash because there's not good solid waste management going on. Apart from all the other issues that are going on, they become completely inundated, and so even a small storm can cause flooding because it's just nowhere for it to run off. So, some of the basic responses are keeping those canals, and that's every year, community-based, simple, that can be implemented, but takes that consistency and the community championing it and understanding it. So,
I was glad to hear you raise this question on setbacks. I know from some of my work on small island developing states, setbacks are well-intentioned but can be very difficult. The people just say to me on small islands, like, Roger Mark, we have nowhere to go. Yeah. You can talk setback, but we can't physically do it. So I think it gets Anita's points about these combined approaches. I wanted to ask you, what about the justice lens? Is that something that you're able to bring to bear on your work, or are you really just responding and saving lives?
So we are really just responding and saving lives, and I see my fabulous colleague from the development side. also very busy all the time, and taking the longer term lens. So we're typically in OFTA. We are a little overwhelmed by the number of high-level responses right now. There are just more than none of them slow down, and so we're not getting to that, and that's a critical question. But yeah.
Okay, Alexandra.
Yeah, so I'll kind of try to tackle the justice lens. I think one could argue that if you think of these issues through that justice lens, through low income, gender, that these vulnerable communities are disproportionately affected, that I think if you were to think of it through that, it would necessitate the drafting of stricter laws. And it would necessitate really making these decisions to say, look, this kind of building cannot happen in these areas, and an enforcement of it. But then that raises the question of, okay, so great, now you've restricted building or movement into these areas, much like you mentioned, but they have to live somewhere. And so they're going to be pushed into another area that you haven't accounted for, or something's going to happen. So that has to be tied to, okay, we can prevent restriction, or we can prevent construction or living in these areas, but we have to find a place to house and home these people. And I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but I think that lens raises one of those really challenging conundrums of that you can prevent something from happening, but by the same token, they are a person and they have to be somewhere.
Great, thank you. Eric?
Yeah, I'll volunteer to address, I think, two questions were not addressed. The first one, there was one on climate change, and there was one on examples from developing countries. First on climate change and about the future. When I started working as a young water engineer and as a hydrologist, we had data. We look at it statistically. We can talk about a 50-year flood, a 100-year flood. We build a dam, we can talk about 10,000-year flood. And then people at the time, that was in the early 90s, started talking about climate change, and at the beginning I was very skeptical. Okay, I liked the certainty of statistics. Well, 25 years after, we know that hydrologic stationarity is dead. I'm just quoting a very famous paper that came out about 10 or 15 years ago. So how do we, as engineers, how do we design solutions, any kind of solutions, but how do we size them? How do we assess the level of risk we are willing to tolerate? Well, we still only have the past as a reference. We just need to be a little bit less cocky, a little bit less confident in what we design. And I think the solution is beyond margins of error and margins of safety in what we design, is to really go into a diverse range of solutions, I think, to mix the solutions that Anita presented, and to be able to combine them, because the best way to address complex issues is to have different solutions, and if some of them fail, well, maybe others are going to resist. There is nowadays the idea of robust decisions, robust solutions. That is that we need to make sure that we don't go for the best solutions, but the most resilient solutions, solutions that we think will still work even if what happens is 30, 50% off in one direction or the other. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I think Anita also mentioned adaptive management. We need to learn more. We need to reflect more on what's going on. We need to monitor better, and we need to adjust to what new information and new data we get. So that's the best we can, that's the best I can provide on that front. But we need to really be less sure of ourselves, especially engineers. The predict and act thing, we need to really put a wrench on that and be much more flexible in what we design, much more humble in what we design and what we think can solve issues. The second question was in terms of land use and regulations and addressing the issues of communities living in marginal lands, and are there successful examples? Well, that's something I was researching last week because I was wondering about that. So far, the only example I found is in China. China, after the 1998 floods, they've had a policy of basically, they came up with a national flood management plan, okay? And unlike other developing countries where they come up with a plan and there is a wide range of government agencies who are supposed to implement the plan, and nobody really does that much because there's not that much funding, and then nobody's really responsible for the plan because it cuts across many agencies. Well, in China, very often when they want to do something, they do it. Right or wrong, but they do it. It's top-down. There are accountable targets. Regional leaders have to make things happen in quantity, not necessarily in quality, but things have to happen. So there is a national flood authority in China that makes things happen. They've been doing a lot in terms of green infrastructure. I think actually WWF has been involved in that. But they've been also doing relocation, resettlement. We are talking millions of people. I mean, it's like Soviet Union or China has always had a history of moving people. Well, they are moving people. In the past 20 or 30 years, they've moved a few million people, actually. And I think at least 1 million or 2 of those people are what you can call ecological migrants. They are moving them because they think they are in dangerous areas that they have decided they are not going to protect because they want to protect other areas, cities and more economically viable areas. So they are moving people. They are resettling them in new villages. Is it a success? Well, we'll see. But, you know, it's always tricky to move communities. You can move them into new villages. You can give them basic services. The tricky part always is to give them livelihoods. I mean, it's not because you give them a piece of land that they necessarily know what to grow and how to grow it if you don't train people. And so I think it's a solution. I mean, you know, if you remove people from marginal lands where they may get killed or seriously impacted by floods and other natural disasters, you're removing them from harm's way. But now you're moving them to other areas that are supposedly better, but are they making a living there? And yeah, we'll see. I mean, as always, there are mixed. There was a recent article in the New York Times about resettling people in China, and of course, some people are pretty happy because they have a new apartment building and they have running water and they have electricity and it's nice. And some other people say, well, yeah, but we don't have a job. And I used to have a living there. I used to fish, or I used to have to grow land. Here, the land, the soil is not good, or I don't know, the crops I used to grow there, here they don't work, and I don't know what to do. So it's tricky. I mean, buyback and relocation in developed countries, yeah, okay, you have the economic viability, like George was saying, to do that. In other places, you don't. You know, and again, the attention span is always very short. I mean, in Pakistan, when there is a flood, everybody rushes. The Pakistani government says they are going to do things. They come up with a new plan, and then they have so many other priorities. You know, that's the issue. One interesting thing, I was looking at the impact, the economic impact of floods. And I could be wrong there, but I've always had the feeling that floods have a massive economic impact. You know, they lower the GDP, etc. Well, I've looked at several cases. They actually don't. You know, each time there's a flood, they say, oh, it will put the GDP down by several percent. Most of the numbers I've seen, and even the figures that were mentioned this morning, a flood at most will do 0.1, 0.5% of the GDP. And most of the time, I mean, if you look at, for example, the GDP for Pakistan in 2010, it actually went up that year. And even the year after. Actually, the year after, it went higher up. Why? Well, because in all those rural areas, when you have a flood, the following year, you have a bumper crop. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, again, and it's a question of justice, who gets impacted? Because the year after, they are going to grow more crops, but who's going to grow crops? Most of the poor communities who had to move out, when they move back in, they don't necessarily have the seed to resume their farming. They don't have the tools to resume their farming, okay? So most of the time, what do? They rent out their land or they sell their land. So the land is used, but by landlords who have more capacity to do something out of it. So the economic return is there, but it doesn't go to people who lost everything. One small but important thing I want to mention is that in terms of, you know, marginal lands, and in 91, when I moved to Bangladesh, that was my first job, I worked on cyclone protection. In April 1991, there was a cyclone that basically killed 300,000 people. Okay, and I actually moved into Bangladesh like 2 months after. I had not heard of it. It was not in the news in the world. 300,000 people. Imagine the number of people that is. Okay, were died basically. Half of them during the event, half of them in the 2 months after from hunger and disease. Okay, so that's a kind of scope we are dealing with, but it's tricky to deal with again, its population. I mean, people live in marginal lands, and how do you move them out? Where are we going to? And where I wanted to link to is that at the end of the day, all this links to security. It links to political stability, political security, because it leads to migrations. And I think the point we need to think about is that at the end of the day, water security is not just about flooding. It's really a cross-sectoral issue that can impact everything. And in terms of justice, well, it's a question of justice and a bit of redistribution and protecting the poor and addressing poverty.
Great, thank you. So as we wrap up the panel, I wanted to ask you whether you had any final comments. We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned that you think is important for our colleagues to have as they walk out of our discussion today? So Eric, why don't we start with you and then come up the side. Anything that you think we haven't mentioned that you'd like to make sure is included as part of today's conversation?
Well, one small thing that struck me in Bangladesh is that when a cyclone comes, they have warning systems, okay? And what happens is that people evacuate. Poor people don't evacuate. Why they don't evacuate? Well, because they have very little, and if they evacuate, they will lose the very little, which is their housing and their livestock. I mean, we've mentioned it, but that's a very critical point. Your livestock in many places is your bank account. Simple. I mean, they don't have any savings. The only savings they have is a cow. And if they're in trouble, they sell the cow, $500, and with $500, you can survive several months when you're living with $2 a day. Okay? So they don't want to go away without their livestock, and they don't want to go out to leave their housing, because that's, even if it's a small hut, that's all they have. And that's something to keep in mind, you know, because we can have the best warning system in Bangladesh, have very nice warning systems nowadays. I mean, and they do, they raise awareness, and they do exercises, and etc., and still people die. So again, we need to link relief to development, and we need to move beyond saving lives. We need to save livelihoods. And that's much more difficult, especially if we want to do it in an equitable manner.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Sure. So I would say one final comment that I'd like to make is, I think, and Eric again touched on something that I've been thinking about, is that, you know, when we think about flooding, we also need to think about droughts. We need to think about access to water and sanitation. We need to think about water resource management in general, as well as infrastructure resilience. And again, I risk being overwhelming and listing something, you know, having a long list of things that we need to think about. But that's the context in which we're living, right? So there are floods happening in some areas, but there's droughts happening in other areas. And so countries like the United States experience both of these at the same time. So California was experiencing a drought, while at the same time we were having flooding and extreme weather and hurricanes down in Texas and elsewhere. So this concept of water security and being able to think about all of these issues at the same time and think about water resources management a bit more broadly is going to be really important moving forward. And capitalizing on the crisis, I think, is both good and bad at times. So we need to be careful at not just having very quick responses that are reactive and then create these long-term impacts, but long-term solutions that aren't really designed to be long-term solutions. So, and what we need to do is when we have these crises, it's a really important kind of step to step back and say, okay, what do we need to do looking forward? You know, what does water resources management look like in our country or our community, or what does water security look like? If we need to guarantee access to these services, what does that look like? And law and planning, but really transparency and stakeholder engagement is a huge aspect to that. So I would say the very first step that we really need to take is somehow making this conversation, like I said before, accessible to everybody. So we're a bunch of experts in this room. Most of you, I would assume, work in this field. You have some kind of expertise relating to water or sanitation or flood or disaster prevention and response, risk reduction. But there's such a much larger community that we need to reach with these issues. And so that is really our obligation as the experts, as the people running these organizations, in the government, is to make these issues accessible to people who are being impacted by these decisions. You know, the low-income people who can't move from their villages are not being engaged in this process. There needs to be solutions for them so that they can escape from these disasters, that they can move with everyone else and find a way to take their cow with them. I mean, this is not something we have here, but there are ranchers in California that face the same dilemma during the drought, during the wildfire season. I mean, there are similarities across Africa and the U.S. that I think are really interesting as well. So some of the solutions that we're employing here in the U.S. I think can be adapted in Africa, and I think if we have a more kind of broader approach that will also, at least as part of the conversation, that will help us to move forward in a more constructive and sustainable way.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, I'd like to say thank you again. This has been a really interesting conversation to be part of. One of the things that jumps to my mind is that we're quite driven, at least in the U.S. government response and development programming, by the pots of money that we have. We have international disaster assistance funds and we have development funds. And we work on different, I mentioned earlier, we tend to think in the disaster response in a 6-month to maybe 2-year frame. In the development, we're thinking often in a 5-year frame. And it's, I would love to see more creative engagement on how to either come up with a different pot of money that's more flexible on the time frame so that we're linking, or there are some crisis modifiers that can be used in development. There are some longer term disaster risk reduction programmings, but we have a long way to go in figuring out. And I think of relief to development, I actually think of relief development, you know, not, it's never quite a smooth path and it shifts back and forth and around. And so we are, I've got to say, the U.S. is doing a tremendous amount of work around the world every day, both in our country and in very vulnerable populations where we might not have a justice lens, we do have a needs-based lens. But there's a lot more we can do. And so this dialogue is important to continue and engage broadly. Thank you.
Sure. I want to be optimistic, because I am. Recognizing that my experience is from the United States. So I do not have, I've traveled a bit around the world, but I've not had to implement these in other places and can appreciate how much more difficult that is. Although I have to say the low-income neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. are about as poor as some of the places I've seen anywhere, and that's where I spend most of my time. I stopped counting when I hit 3,000 public meetings that I've done in my career. So the notion of doing outreach is something that's very close to me. But I would say that the optimism I feel is that none of these things are exclusive or in conflict with each other. I believe the recon must be done. Solutions must be determined quickly and implemented in order to gain the flexibility and support for the longer term, more sustainable solutions that have to be sustained over a long period of time. They're not mutually exclusive. They work together. It's by doing something quick, having someone see a response, getting political buy-in because you now have acted to support whoever is in need. That's the support that you need for a longer term strategy that will engage far more broad level of public to engage in the longer term solutions that are needed on planning and zoning and master planning and all the rest that aren't quick fixes. The same is with the practical implementation. When we went in and did backwater valves, which is what they're called, to stop the sewage, that wasn't expensive. That was $2,500. I know that is for some people, so we subsidized it. But we could do that within a month, and people could see us acting, and they understood. That gave us, in that neighborhood, when we had to tear up their streets for over 3 years to put in a more longer-term strategy, that they had seen the steps we were taking in the immediate. So again, quick, short-term matched with gaining the benefit and strength and staying power to do the longer-term strategies that are necessary. they complement each other, and I think they can work. And my sense is you do them both. You need immediate, and there are immediate steps you can take so people see relief. You don't want the emergency to get so great that bad decisions are made, and that's also very common, that some decisions made because nothing else has happened and now the political structure demands something and it's poor. But I'm optimistic. I think we've been able to implement strategies that combine these longer term, shorter term, immediate, longer term, high cost, low cost, and a thoughtful strategy. It can be done, and I'm optimistic about what we can do in the future.
Thank you. Anita?
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. I agree with everything that was said, and I could stay here for another 2 hours and talk about all of this and more. So this has been a fascinating discussion. I guess just a couple of final, random thoughts. First of all, I think we need to get out of the habit of talking about natural disasters. There's no such thing. There's natural hazards, but the disaster is the impact of that hazard on a vulnerable community. So we have to stop thinking about things as being natural disasters. I also do believe that climate change changes everything. And as one wise sage said, the future ain't what it used to be. So we have to really be, as Alexandria pointed out, we have to be really diligent in the way that we do our work, the way that we conceptualize our work, the way we think of ourselves as professionals, the way that we manage ourselves, at home and at work. And for me, I really have a desire and a passion and a great interest in helping to train the next generation of practitioners and getting the environmentalists and the climate change science folks and the humanitarian professionals and the urban planners, everything that's represented here and more, into the same room to think about what is the future going to be like for all of us. It's not just about climate change. We can't throw up our hands and say we can't manage flooding because of climate change. That's a factor and a big factor, but there's so many other issues, and we have to start learning as professionals how can we break down those artificial barriers and silos and get more comfortable with the idea of systems thinking and long-term thinking and managing this tension between, yes, doing something quick, having action on the ground, while also not then doing that, having that exasperate future risk. It's not easy. And but like George, I do feel optimistic. The level of engagement and the openness to thinking differently and to thinking and working with people outside of our comfort zone is where I think we need to go and where there's a lot of opportunity. And then just lastly, we could have a sequel to this discussion just on donors and just on financing, because that's such an important role, and we didn't have enough time to really dig into that, but I think that's another key factor. So again, thank you for including us and for your excellent facilitation.
Thank you. Well, wow, what a rich and engaging discussion today. I think we covered different types of floods. We talked about flash floods, overbank river floods, pluvial flooding, and we had this reaffirmation that not all types of floods are bad, but ultimately we cannot control them. We need to think about how we mitigate risks. I think that provided some important framing for us as we think about where to go next and what it means. I think from there we had an important discussion to look at the impact. We talked about the impact in terms of relief. We talked about long-term impact. We talked about differential impact. We talked about this a little bit from a justice lens. We talked about who evacuates and who doesn't. What is their connection to housing and livestock and the degree to which this is their bank account. We talked about the connection between development and humanitarian assistance and how that dovetails with thinking about timeframes and cycles and funding and policy and political frameworks. We talked about populations on the brink, those who are most at risk, those who are most vulnerable. And that led to some discussion and engagement about water security overall, recognizing that there are multiple threats. We could face flooding, but droughts at the same time. How do we have a more holistic, integrated approach to looking at these issues? We talk about infrastructure and infrastructure resilience, the importance of livelihoods, methods, of networks, of natural and nature-based flood management, and the importance of a combination of methods. Some of the key themes that came out, I think, from our discussion today was don't oversimplify green infrastructure. We talked about the importance of global standards. We talked about being clear and having clarity on what we mean. You know, we had examples of green infrastructure, resilient, sustainable bioinfrastructure, making sure that we have some clarity on what that means. We talked about the importance of physical and virtual demonstration sites. The question of cost kept coming up. George said, you know, solutions are all expensive. What do we do? How do we manage that? A very important reminder of looking at history. History as a guide. What worked at one time? You know, you're looking at DC and having to deal with horse manure, and that was a good solution at one point in time. How do we change? What does that mean for our infrastructure? But yet there were some historical solutions that were good and useful. We don't dismiss everything. How do we learn from that? How do we deal with climate change and uncertainty? How do we anticipate scenarios and think about what that means? How do we engage people? Not just people in terms of gathering and getting data and historical information, but how do we get civil engineers to be more comfortable engaging with people? How do we avoid damn in both senses of the word? How do we raise awareness? What's the role of law, policies, procedures? How do we deal with putting risk and responsibility onto different communities? Do we think about forcibly removing or relocating? How do we provide incentives? How do we facilitate a freedom of choice? How do we limit or curtail rebuilding in flood-prone areas? And I think ultimately it led to a series of questions and operating principles for us as we think about capitalizing on the crisis of flooding. What do we protect? At what level of risk? Who pays for it? How do we save lives and livelihoods? Who sets the rules when we think of an impact that moves across jurisdictions? How do we make the questions on water security accessible to all, particularly to those who are being impacted? How do we approach this as a cross-sectoral issue that affects us all? How do we balance these quick, short-term wins with long-term trends? And how we do that in a way that we have a justice lens? Wow, you guys covered a lot. Please join me in thanking the panel.